So, how does a massive global system, one that created huge wealth for centuries, all built on the suffering of millions, how does something like that just end? Today, we're going to trace the incredible, really complex story of how the transatlantic slave trade, one of the most brutal institutions in human history, was finally torn down. Let's start with a number that's, well, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. 12 million. That's the best estimate we have for the number of African men, women, and children who were captured, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic over the course of 300 years. It's a scale of tragedy that literally fueled a global economy. So how did this horrific engine actually work? Well, it all came down to a brutally efficient economic cycle. We've probably heard of it, the triangular trade. It was a system that locked three continents together in this just devastating chain of exploitation. And the cycle was relentless. Here's how it worked. First, ships would leave Europe packed with things like guns, textiles, and rum. They'd sail to Africa and trade those goods for human beings. Then came the second leg, the absolutely monstrous part, the Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans were packed into ships under conditions so horrible, it's hard to even imagine for the journey to the Americas. And then finally, the goods they were forced to produce, sugar, cotton, tobacco, were shipped back to Europe, making a ton of money for investors and completing the triangle. For centuries, this system just seemed unbreakable. I mean, to the people getting rich off of it, it was just the way the world worked. But then, around the late 1700s, something started to shift. Powerful new ideas, incredible moral courage, and just astonishing acts of resistance, they all started hammering away at the system's foundations. The first cracks started to appear. And the pushback, it came from all over, all at once. You had religious groups like the Quakers, who were some of the very first to say, this is just morally wrong, period. At the same time, you've got the Enlightenment spreading these new ideas about liberty and human rights, which made the whole idea of slavery look like the massive hypocrisy it was. And of course, you had the powerful words of formerly enslaved people telling their stories, and the inspiration of revolutions in America and France. But let's never, ever forget the most important force of all, the constant, unending resistance of enslaved Africans themselves, who fought for their own freedom every single day. And hearing directly from those who survived, well, it was absolutely devastating to the pro-slavery argument. This quote is from Olaudah Equiano. He was a formerly enslaved man, and his autobiography became a total bestseller. For the first time, his words forced the public in Europe who'd been shielded from all this to really confront the sheer horror of the Middle Passage. It wasn't just numbers anymore. He gave a human face to the suffering, and it lit a fire under the abolitionist cause. But nothing, and I mean nothing, changed the game like the Haitian Revolution. This wasn't just another revolt that got put down. No, this was a successful, full-blown war for independence. For the very first time in history, an enslaved people rose up, defeated their colonial rulers, were talking Napoleon's France, and created their own independent nation. You can imagine the shockwave. It's an absolute terror through slave-owning societies everywhere. But for abolitionists and for enslaved people, it was undeniable proof that freedom could be won. So you've got this perfect storm brewing, right? Moral outrage, powerful stories, revolutionary ideas, and the terrifying, inspiring example of Haiti. The pressure was building and building. The big question was, which of the major powers would crack first? And the irony is, it was the nation that had profited the most from the slave trade, Great Britain. The big turning point came in 1807 with the Slave Trade Act. After decades of campaigning by abolitionists like William Wilberforce, the British Parliament finally passed this game-changing law. Now, and this is a really crucial point we'll come back to, it didn't end slavery itself, but it made it illegal to buy or sell human beings anywhere in the massive British Empire. This was the first major domino to fall. And get this wasn't just some law on a piece of paper. Britain put its money where its mouth was. They used their incredible naval power, creating the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron. This fleet had one job and one job only: patrol the coast of Africa, hunt down illegal slave ships, and free the people on board. And they did. Between 1808 and 1860, they captured over 1,500 ships. So Britain's move, it just set this huge precedent. They started using a combination of diplomacy and, let's be honest, the threat of their giant navy to push other countries to do the same. It created this global ripple effect, this cascade that would slowly but surely start to choke off the international slave trade for good. And you can see the dominoes start to fall. Just a year after Britain, Boom, the United States bans the importation of slaves. Then France follows in 1818. Now, it wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, and there was a ton of resistance and illegal trading, but the momentum, it was undeniable. By 1850, even Brazil, which was the single largest importer of enslaved Africans, had finally caved to the pressure and officially shut down its trade. Okay, but this is where we have to pause, because there's a really, really important distinction to make. Abolishing the trade was a massive historic achievement, but it was not the end of the fight, not even close. For the millions of people who were already enslaved in the Americas, their nightmare just continued. You really have to understand the difference here, because it's critical. Ending the trade meant stopping the ships, stopping the buying and selling of people across the ocean. But ending slavery? That meant tearing down the entire legal and social system that said it was okay for one person to own another. Think of it like this. One is shutting down the factory. The other is dealing with the toxic product that's already everywhere. Two very different fights. And the time gap between those two steps? It's just staggering. Look at Britain. They ended the trade in 1807, but it took another 26 years to actually free the enslaved people in their colonies. In the US, that gap was almost 60 years, and it took a horrific civil war to finally make it happen. And Brazil, the very last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery, waited a full 38 years after ending the trade to finally grant freedom in 1888, a whole generation. When you look back at it, the legacy of this movement is just huge. This was about more than ending one specific injustice. What these abolitionists did really was create the playbook for the modern international human rights campaign. They proved that ordinary citizens could band together across borders to challenge powerful economic interests and change the world. It was a model for the fights for women's rights, workers' rights, and civil rights for generations to come. So what does this all leave us with? The fight to end the slave trade was long, it was brutal, and it was incredibly difficult. But it proved that a global injustice could be dismantled. It showed that when you combine moral conviction, political action, and courageous resistance, you can tear down even the most powerful systems of exploitation. Which kind of begs the question for us today. What can we learn from their victory as we face the great injustices of our own time?